My interest in decolonization was sparked with an article written in 2005. Lawrence Duar advocated the decolonization of anti-racist practice. At first, this confused me. Why would anti-racist practice need to be decolonized? Surely decolonization should be directed at Eurocentric centers of power, not the tools that help us dismantle these centers of power. This is true, but decolonial scholarship compels us to scrutinize these tools before we use them. After all, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So Lawrence and Duar observed that the tools of anti-racist practice are tainted because they fail to adequately include indigenous voices. How we see race is narrow and distorted because we see race through a Eurocentric lens. What struck me about this article was this dilemma. Out of whose land would the 40 acres be carved? Out of whose land would the 40 acres be carved? This promise of 40 acres was the American government's attempt to provide a form of reparations to the newly freed slaves. Of course, this promise was later withdrawn, but the idea of giving 40 acres to the newly freed slaves was seen as a largely positive proposal. This was the least that the American government could do to repay the suffering it had caused. But out of whose land would the 40 acres be carved? It would be from the indigenous people's land. Duar and Lawrence mentioned this, not because they were playing the oppression Olympics. It is much deeper than that. Out of whose land would the 40 acres be carved is truly a decolonial question because it embodies two dilemmas. First, one man's freedom can be another man's continued oppression. There is no idealism here. There is no utopia. President Lincoln made history. In the same week that he signed the Emancipation Proclamation that emancipated millions of enslaved African Americans, he also approved the hanging of 38 indigenous men, the largest mass hanging in US history. Second, such a question compels us to look at the tools that serve us. We are compelled to interrogate the constructs such as race, gender, class, the nation state, and so on. We often accept these constructs without investigation, as if they are divine. Who developed these constructs, and for what purpose? Are these constructs suited for our projects? These two dilemmas typify decolonial scholarship. We see this wrestling with dilemmas from the very first writings. These first writings are referred to as the decolonial turn. It is the point when the colonial subject, who was educated in the colonial system, turns around to face his colonizer and then questions his colonizer. He no longer accepts his inferiority and grows skeptical of everything he has received from the colonizer.
Let me understand this. You two came here to question me?
This decolonial turn epitomizes W.E.B. Du Bois's work in the early 20th century. For the first time, we hear the voices of those that have been subjected. We understand the perspectives of those that have been problematized. More importantly, we see the dilemma between the inside and the outside. Inside, Du Bois recognizes his humanity and he realizes his worth. But outside of himself, the wider society tells him that he has no humanity. He has no worth. I cannot imagine the mental strength of someone believing that they are fully human when every fabric of society is telling him that he is not. Some decades later, the field of decolonization was firmly established with Francophone scholarship. Césaire, Memmi, Fanon. These works are written in the furnace of colonization. They were written amid the physical presence of colonial forces in the global south. The dilemma faced by these authors was reconciling their colonial upbringing with their growing awakening of the negative impact of colonization. However, something curious was observed. The colonial forces had physically left their territories and had seemingly handed back power to their subjects, but the minds and the bodies of the former subjects still bore the effects of colonization. The vestiges of colonization were still present in these countries. It was as if the colonial forces never left. What we now know as post-colonial scholarship observed these curiosities. The diaspora from Asia and the Middle East focused on the cultural legacy of colonization. Building on this, we see the development of the coloniality or decoloniality literature, primarily coming from Latin American scholarship. Castro Gomez, Quijano, Maldonado Torres, Mignolo. Their dilemma was, how is it possible, after all these years, that colonization still maintains its grip on society? Even though there were several decolonization movements, and much was written about this topic, yet the dark clouds of coloniality still loomed over their societies. So they drew our attention to how knowledge is categorized, produced, controlled, legitimized, and delegitimized. Finally, the present phase takes us directly to the university curricula. With the end of the oppressive and racist apartheid system, South African scholars observed that the curricula remained mostly Eurocentric and reinforced Western dominance and privilege. At the present time, the bulk of scholarship emanates from and is influenced by the Rainbow Nation. This is just a snapshot, and we should not see this as canon. There are many works and authors that could be mentioned, but what is fascinating about this snapshot is that it bears the voices from the global south, talking to each other, critiquing each other, building on each other's works, and also the works mentioned did not dismiss the European canon. They simply disinfected it, reformulated it, and repurposed it for their particular projects.